Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. I'm your host, Jamie Gale. Today on Life with Strings Attached, we're joined by Dana Bourgeois of Bourgeois Guitars, a true icon in the world of acoustic guitar making whose influence has quietly shaped the way modern luthiers build, voice, and imagine steel string guitars. With over 50 years of experience at the workbench, Dana Bourgeois has carved out a singular path in his craft, blending deep technical knowledge with a relentless pursuit of tone. From building his first guitar in his college dorm room, armed only with a book and the encouragement from a woodworking father and machinist grandfather, Dana has gone on to inspire generations of builders and players alike. In this conversation, Dana shares his remarkable journey from the post-Beatles guitar boom in the 1960s and 70s to his early days repairing instruments in Maine and his pivotal collaborations with legends like Tony Rice and Eric Schoenberg. He takes us inside the evolution of Bourgeois guitars, from the revival of the OM style to innovations in bracing, voicing, and wood torrefications that have set a new standard for tone and responsiveness. We also explore how Dana's early interest in art restoration might continue to inform his work today, the economics and tooling challenges behind launching new models, and the importance of community, knowledge sharing, and cultural fit, especially as Bourgeois Guitars enters a new chapter. Whether you're a luthier, a player, or just someone fascinated by the intersection of guitar, tradition, innovation, and sound, this is a rare chance to learn from one of the most thoughtful and experienced voices in modern guitar making. It was a pleasure to have Dana Bourgeois on the show, and I hope that you enjoyed as much as I did. Hey, Dana.
Hey,
Thanks,
Jamie.
thanks for being on the show. Welcome to Life with Strings Attached.
Thanks very much. Happy to be here.
Great. How are things up there in Maine?
Well, it stopped raining, which is good. We've had very soggy spring, and
Yes.
so everyone's happy.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Is it normally you said it's exceptionally wet for you there, is it?
Well, spring is our rainy season, and sometimes it's rainier than other
Yeah.
years. So this is one of those years that we've had more rainy and cloudy days than sunny days. So
Yeah. You know,
if you have
years
outdoor work to do, it's a problem.
yes. You know, years ago, I packed my family up and went on the road. We bought a motorhome and I traveled with a lot of guitars to a lot of guitar stores. And I was up there in New England and I remember they had something like, I don't know, like 27 or 28 days of rain out of 30 in that year. And
It
yeah,
happens.
we got ourselves stuck in the campsite. Didn't have a concrete pad or anything. It was just on the
Oh,
grass.
yeah,
I ended up
not good.
backing the motorhome out through a forest because it would go reverse, but it wasn't moving forward with the rear wheel
Wow.
drive. So those memories you trigger.
Yep.
So anyways, so there's a whole lot of stuff that we could be talking with. You've got 50 years of guitar making, and presumably you didn't start the moment you were born, so you've got probably a whole lot of living before you started making guitars also. And so,
A little bit. Yeah, I'm 72, so.
yes, yeah, great. So I think that maybe one of the great ways to get through this would be, you know, if we could just have a bit of where you were born, when you were born, to whom, a brief biography, and then just the
Mhm.
moments in your life that perhaps if we remove those moments, might not be the person you are today. And let me give you a bit of an example on that, because sometimes I mean that in a bit of a personal way, in the fact that, so by the time I was 20, I had moved 20 times. I moved a lot. Sometimes I went to two schools in a year. Actually, often I went to two schools in a year. And as a result, it helps me do what I do now. People say, Jamie, how do you travel all the time? How do you do it? Don't you miss being home? Well, if you understand that Jamie moved 20 times by the time he was 20, I don't really have the same sense of home that most people do. I'm
Sure.
quite nomadic. And so that helps people understand who I am. And so those kinds of moments, those ones that shape you.
Hmm.
And so can you sort
Well,
of
I'll
take us
see if I
back
can
72 years?
see if I can identify some of those moments. So I am from the Portland area, Portland, Maine area,
Hmm.
and my family goes back in that area to the 1700s, on
Hmm.
an island in Casco Bay, and where I still have a home, a second home. My roots are pretty deep, and I've really never moved out of Cumberland County, which is where I live. I live in Brunswick, Maine now.
Hmm.
My shop is kind of over the line in Androscoggin County. It's half an hour commute from my home, kind of thing. Um, I went to Bowdoin College and in Brunswick, Maine, and I live sort of within spitting distance of the college right now. The college is, I have six abutters, four of which are Bowdoin College.
Hmm.
Um, and I started playing guitar. Um, well, first of all, my dad played guitar. So I grew up with my dad and, his siblings and my mom's family sitting around singing and playing music on weekends, that kind of thing. That was a family get together. Um, and he liked popular music from the post-war period, or even earlier. He liked country music. He liked bluegrass. Um, yes, I was exposed to, a bunch of different kinds of music. I never really thought of myself as being musical, and until I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show in
Hmm.
1964,
Hmm.
and I had to have a guitar, but I didn't want an acoustic guitar. I wanted an electric guitar. And as it turns out, a lot of my generation had the same urge. There was a big guitar explosion in the mid 60s.
Yeah.
And I often tell my kids that the guitar was my video game. It was,
Hmm.
the kind of thing that I did, learn to play guitar. It was a way to meet other people, sit and play music, learn these tunes, practice, try to figure out, some strange chord in a Beatles song, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And and I think that, that just never left me. When I went to college, I fell in with other musicians. And one day I was at, in a bookstore downtown, and in the window I saw Irving Sloane's book, Classic Guitar Construction. Um,
In the bookstore window, like it was a
it
promotional
was
item.
literally displayed in the window, because that book is really a lot of beautiful photos. I mean, on the cover,
Hmm.
there's a picture of like the open rim of a guitar with all of the lining and the blocks and the just a really fascinating picture. And so I bought the book on the spot, read it, or mostly looked at the pictures. And as it turns out, my dad was an amateur woodworker. My grandfather was a machinist. They both
Hmm.
had shops. We grew up around tools, watching them be used. I never had much inclination to use tools or to make things, but I guess when I got the urge, I wasn't intimidated. And I also
Hmm.
had a couple people I could go to for advice, that kind of thing.
Sure.
So I
Hmm.
literally built my first guitar my senior year in college, mostly in my my college room,
Hmm.
dorm room, um, with a little help from my grandfather, my father. There was a fellow in town who had a woodworking shop, and he helped me out.
Hmm.
And as it turns out, the as a how-to book, Irving Sloane's book is, there's a lot of pretty highlights that are photographed, but it's kind of lean on how you get from here to here sometimes. So you
Okay.
had to do a lot of figuring out. My
Some
friend
gray
Michael
space.
Cohn, who's a classical guitar maker
Hmm.
lives in Maui, said anyone who could successfully finish a guitar by the Irving Sloane method was destined for a career as a luthier. That was his quip. As it turns out, a lot of other people like Roger Sadowski,
Yeah.
other people have cited this book as,
Yeah.
the thing that got them into lutherie. And if you
Yeah.
recall, I mean, back in the day, the mid 70s, there was no internet, there were no guitar schools, there were no luthiers you could visit. There happened to be one in Maine, Nick Apollonio, who I did visit, and I was able to, you know, get a peek at the inside of a real guitar, acoustic guitar shop, but he didn't want, kids hanging around,
Mhm.
understandably, all the time. He was gracious enough to invite me in once.
Mhm.
Uh, so there was a lot of self-teaching. I think that my generation of builders are quite self-taught. So I guess I'd identify that as a sort of a structural moment, in
Mhm.
my career,
Mhm.
in the sense that, to get from here to here, you got to figure out how to do it. There are 10 or
Yeah.
20 different ways, and you might have to, go through several of them to
Mhm.
get there.
Mhm.
Now, if you go to a guitar school, you're taught one way to make something, and then that's how you do it.
Mhm.
Um, so I grew up with, I think, the sense that, you have to find the best way, or you have to find the most appropriate way for whatever your circumstances are. And that leads to innovation. It leads to
How
thinking
so?
out of the box all the time.
Are you referring to your time in navigating through Irvin Sloane's book, or are you talking about growing up in general? I mean, because a lot of people wouldn't have filled in the blanks there. A lot of people would have said this is too complicated and given up. What is it about you and your history you think that you're the kind of person who took on the challenge and didn't give it up?
Well, it just fit within my interests, I suppose. I mean, you know, I've always wanted to be close to musicians.
Hmm.
Um, it, you know, th- I don't, I don't, I don't know what made me say I'm going to build that first guitar. But once I built that first guitar, it took me the better part of a year to
Hmm.
build it. And of course, I talked it up with all of my friends, and people came over and saw it and watched it being built, etc. And so there was a sort of that became part of my identity in the community as a guy who's building a guitar.
Hmm.
Well, all of a sudden, everyone started bringing their guitars to me. Can you fix this? Can you fix that? Because not only was there not a luthier on every corner, there wasn't a repair tech on every corner.
Hmm.
And before I knew it, I had an apartment full of, guitar cases and a lot of work in front of me if I
Yeah.
wanted it. And
Yeah.
that was my first career, was repairing guitars for 10 years.
Well, I think it's interesting to point out, you talked about the Beatles, the Ed Sullivan Show, the sort of guitar boom that happened, is there was a lot of explosion of factories trying to meet the demand of all these people who wanted guitars who didn't know a lot about what they were doing yet. And so the guitar making was much more archaic with the guitars you would have started with than the inexpensive guitars that we find today. I mean, like, we had to fight with those student guitars to make them
Yeah.
work. Even when I started, which was quite a few years later, I still had a cheap harmony guitar from Sears where the strings were very
Hmm.
high and the pickup was on a slab of plywood,
Yeah.
and it was, you had to want to do that. It was
Yeah,
they weren't a lot of
exactly.
help.
Yeah, and those were the kind of guitars that kind of, came my way. A lot of
Yeah.
them, a lot of them were also nicer guitars. It was just, they needed new frets, or
Mhm.
the nut had broken out or something, or, there were all grades of guitars. I mean, Martin, Gibson, Fender were still making, good quality
Sure.
guitars, although not
Yep.
as good as they had been pre-Beatles.
Yes.
And you're right, they did that. All of those factories exploded, and production dramatically increased, and quality kind of went downhill. And I think that's what created, by the time the '70s, late '70s, early '80s rolled around, that created a demand among musicians you know, for a better guitar than a new one that they could buy. They could go to a music store and buy. The vintage
Mhm.
market had just started to heat up, so these older guitars were more valuable. The new guitars were not very, were, let's say not necessarily up to the level of playability of someone who started playing 10 years earlier.
Hmm.
And so there's a little bit of a vacuum. There's a little bit of a demand for a handmade guitar.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that kind of helped the transition from being a repairman to actually selling guitars.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, yeah. And there were interesting things that were happening even with the big companies that survived those periods. And I do mean survive.
Sure.
There's a lot of people who don't realize that Fender, Gibson, they were on the verge of bankruptcy during these years. They were
So was
they're
Martin.
Yeah, so was Martin. The quality was really down. They were just trying to push out numbers during this period. And it wasn't till, well, I mean, most of those companies, with the exception of Martin, flipped ownership in the
Mhm.
early 1980s because they were just in a bad state. And I don't know that the average guitar player recognizes that right now. And so, but this is the
Yeah,
period that you are developing in. This is the period. This is the petri dish of of your
exactly.
early business development. Is this
Yeah,
boom of guitars? There's a whole lot of things that are not just the American sort of Sears guitars that are happening and the Electros and such, but you're also seeing the Hagstroms and the Echoes and the Framus and the stuff coming in from overseas. And this was a fascinating time to be dealing with stuff. And I imagine you see different kinds of problems than I think people see today who are starting to work on guitars.
absolutely. And I actually
Yeah.
got my first um, opportunity to um, to do something on a national scale because of where Martin was at in the mid '80s.
Hmm.
I had been working for the Music Emporium doing repairs back when they were
Hmm.
in Cambridge. Music Emporium was one of sort of the inventors of the vintage guitar, so to speak. They were, like early purveyors of vintage instruments.
Yep.
And I was among their stable of repairmen,
Hmm.
who would restore instruments, try to learn how to do it, in a proper style. I had worked for an art museum when I was in college, and after I went to college, and I wanted to go to graduate school in museum science. I wanted to learn how to restore art, so I had a
Hmm.
little bit of exposure to um, you don't just slap stuff back together. There's a proper way to do it. Everything should be reversible, etc. And
Let's not blow past that for a second. Let's
sure.
come back. We went from you being born, presumably you learned to walk and eat, and then all of a sudden you were making guitar in college. I want to, if it's okay with you, I want to know a little bit more about, you said that you developed the reputation as this guy who made the guitar, but I want to know more about, what size was this town that you grew up in? Was this a city? Was this a small town where everybody knew each other? What's the environment in which you're growing up? And
Small town. It was sort of a suburb of Portland.
Mhm.
Um, it was a mill town. A lot of the towns in Maine, are situated on rivers at falls. And water, the water power was available back in the early 1800s for any kind of factory production. This was a paper mill town. Everyone worked for SD Warren Company,
Mhm.
or worked for some company or some business that serviced SD Warren Company.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
it was a company town, small company town. Everyone knew everyone. Like my high school class might have been 250 kids.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, small community.
Mhm. Mhm.
Maine has very low population. We only have like about 1.4 million people in all of Maine, where it's very, very big state. The distance between Portland and Madawaska, the northernmost um, town in Maine, is the same distance between Portland and New York City.
Mhm.
And yet there's only 1.4 million people. Most of the population, half the population, is in Cumberland County, which is around Portland.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm.
Portland isn't a really big town. It's like, I think the the actual population is about 75,000,
Yeah.
and it's the largest city in Maine. And so Westbrook's an adjacent town, one of the adjacent towns. I don't know
So
what the
a couple
population.
thousand people maybe back when you were growing up there.
Oh, 10 or 15,000.
Yeah. If you had a high
Yeah,
school class of 200 or 250, then you have to have at least
yeah,
probably 10, 15,000. Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right. And you also you went to college, and that wasn't a given at
yes,
this point in time. And so, what were your parents doing? What was your family doing? That what sort of opportunities did you have? Because, you talk about this all like it was just a foregone conclusion, but I don't, which is maybe the perspective of a guy who's lived in the same place his entire life and doesn't know anything
yeah.
different, frankly. I know you're well traveled, don't get me wrong,
Mhm.
but I these statements that you're making, Dana, I think you've done some unusual and remarkable things. You have stood out from your peers. You've made a substantial contribution to the guitar and the guitar's history. You've been involved in a number of things which have, you know, substantial ripple effects. And so I'm trying to understand where this
Yeah.
came from. And for me, every guitar maker that I know who makes a substantial contribution, if you get to know who they are, it all starts to make a little bit more sense.
Hmm.
You can't separate the person from the objects so clearly. And so I've seen the objects, and I want to get, if it's okay with you, I want to get to know the
Oh,
person just a
sure.
little bit better.
Yeah. Well,
So,
it's interesting questions, the kind of things that you're right, sort of growing up in the same place, you gives you a different perspective, perhaps, or gives you a lack of perspective sometimes. Um, my dad worked for the paper mill.
mhm,
Um, in fact, I worked there in the summer times when I was in high school and college. Um, my mom was also a musician a little bit. She played harmonica, very good harmonica. She could play along with anything my father played and sang on guitar. Um, she had a number of different jobs along the way, once kids were old enough for her to be out of the house. Um, I guess possibly the creative side may have come from her because
mhm,
she was an artist also. Um,
mhm.
Let me see what else I can dig into. Uh,
It's a common pairing. I hear a lot that
mhm,
father, grandfather had some sort of workshop where they crafted things with their
mhm,
hands, and that mom was a painter, a dancer,
mhm.
a crafter of some sort. It's actually a pretty normal pairing that results in a guitar maker.
Yeah, yeah. There's an artistic side and a technical side.
Yes.
You got to be able to manage both.
Hmm. Hmm.
Neither parent went to college. It was almost a foregone conclusion that I and my siblings would go to college. They didn't tell us what or how or whatever, but that was the expectation.
Plan. Yeah. Hmm.
And
And how
I
many
did
siblings did
what
you have?
pardon me?
And how
I
many
had a
siblings?
brother, a sister, and a brother. There were three
Sister
of
and a
us.
brother.
I'm the oldest.
You're the oldest. Hmm. Hmm. Okay. And you were all supposed to go to college.
We all did.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I did well in high school. School actually academics have always been easy for me
Hmm.
and a little bit boring. I mean, it seems um almost like I'm bragging, but it's
Hmm.
I always kind of gamed the system a little bit, and I would do what I needed to do to get a respectable grade if I didn't like the course. Other courses I would dive into because I bonded with the teacher or really loved the subject matter.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
it was that balance. And
Hmm.
I when I graduated with honors cum laude from college, I didn't even know it until I was being given my diploma and it was read out, Dana Bourgeois cum laude. So my objective was never to um, sort of like rack up a grade point average. It was always uh, do what you've got to do, and then, learn what you want to learn, kind of
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. And so, what sorts of things interested you? Because there's this point here where you were headed towards art restoration. So, in high school, what were those things that really got you going?
Well, in high school, it was a lot of different things. I mean, I acted in plays, did
Hmm.
that for a little bit. It was mostly the community of artistic people. I mean, I was pretty good at studio art, um,
Hmm.
and I hung with musicians.
Hmm.
Those were my extracurricular interests in high school, and that kind of followed me into college.
Hmm.
Um, art, I started working in the college art museum as a student, and got all kinds of different jobs and different levels of experience. Looked like a good career path. I ended up majoring in art history. And then this whole thing with, these repairs started coming my way without
Hmm.
really doing anything. And one day I realized, I've got all the work I can handle. And I'm doing
Hmm.
this on the side too, but I could see that this could be a full-time job. And the thing that made the difference for me was, I don't know, it wasn't necessarily one experience at work, but many, many little experiences. I actually realized that I didn't really like the people in the art world.
Hmm.
I felt like I didn't fit in. It
Hmm.
was sort of very stuffy, very um, uh, the words escape me, but
Hmm.
whereas in the music world, um, everyone it was much more egalitarian. Everyone was like less focused on status than on, sort of person to person relations and that kind of thing. I
Hmm.
just felt more comfortable, and I made my decision. Okay, I'm going to leave this behind. I can always go back to it.
Hmm.
Let's see where this leads me.
Yeah.
And it led to where I am now, essentially.
Hmm. Hmm. I find that observation you just made, and well, I mean that sort of divide between the fine art world and the craft world,
Hmm.
is a well documented divide, and,
Sure.
and it's a part of a lot of stories. And as I think about the movements of guitar and the work that I do as a curator, there's this refining that happens over time
Hmm.
where, at the beginning it's all lots of different ideas going on, all sorts of different experimentation going on, but eventually we sort of refine it, and we decide that this is what the icon is and this is who the heroes are, and then we all sort of agree that this much more refined object is the thing. And once you get to that very refined version of it, um, then it becomes a lot more about reenacting the hero and about doing it exactly right, but reenacting it exactly right. And in those moments, you know, I've known a number of classical guitar students, let's say, they were all in college or university. And although they were friends with each other, when they performed, everybody is secretly hoping that someone trips and smashes their guitar on the way up, right? Like their own guitar. Like they do not want someone else to do better than them, because it is all about seeking this perfection and this refinement. And that's a very different feeling than when you have all of this tangential ideas about the possibilities of what could be done, which is where I think the guitar was at this era, and I do
Hmm.
mean was of those periods, and there were so many possibilities. And as a matter of fact, you couldn't find someone to tell you what to do. You know,
Yeah,
with
exactly.
you were looking, the book was incomplete, which meant that you had the possibility to write a chapter in the book, and that's a much more open space to be in. Do you think that's fair to say?
So I remember, though, going to my first Guild of American Luthiers convention. I built a few guitars here and there, was,
Okay.
restoring guitars for the Music Emporium. I'm going to say this is about 1980. They had a convention in Boston,
Mm-hmm.
and I saw all of these makers there,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the work was just so different and sort of beyond sort of what you consider the commercial norm, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. John Monteleone and who else was there? Steve Klein.
Mm-hmm.
His stuff is kind of like from Mars,
Mm-hmm.
at least in 1980.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Other builders who I don't know or remember, but it was a real eye opener kind of
Yeah.
thing. There wasn't just one way to do things, and everyone was very um, willing to tell you their secrets, so to speak, how they do this. I mean, back in the day, um, as I say, everyone had to figure this out, right? Everyone
Mm-hmm.
from my
Mm-hmm.
generation had to figure out how you cut fret slots. No one
Mm-hmm.
had CNCs back then. So there was a lot of shop talking, and information was very freely shared. It was quite a wonderful social environment. And so that's another sort of defining aspect of my career. Not that it isn't that way today, but I think that the younger makers have benefited from all of this sharing. I mean, of course, the whole internet, the whole YouTube thing does
Mm-hmm.
promote sharing, but it started somewhere, and it
Yeah.
started sort of back in the day when I was learning my craft, when there was no right way to do anything, and
Mm-hmm.
everyone was
Mm-hmm.
still trying to figure out the best way, or even a viable way,
Mm-hmm.
and very willing to, hey, come on by and see my shop, see all of that stuff. So
Yes.
that had a big impact on my career. People
Mm-hmm.
I could call up or visit, and you know and
Yes.
and say, okay, I'm trying to do this, how do you do it?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think
Yeah.
violin makers don't do that in general.
No, no. As a matter of fact, I teach at guitar making schools as I travel around the world, and the American schools are very different than
Mhm.
the European schools. And the European schools have changed, but all of the European guitar makers that I know that talk about this stuff talk about basically like in Germany, it was illegal for many of the guitar makers I know to make guitars without having been properly trained. They were supposed to be part of the guild system. They were supposed to
Okay.
have
Yeah.
been trained as you were trained as a cabinet maker. You are not allowed to call yourself a guitar maker. Yeah, that's actually what Christian Martin came up against also
Sure.
before,
Yeah.
before he left the old world to come
Some
here.
things don't
But
change.
yeah, I teach in that area where he came from,
Mhm.
also at a school in Germany, which has hundreds of years of tradition. And not I don't want to paint the European schools with too broad of a brush here. There's that has changed, and it's all a part of it now, and they're much more open, they're much more sharing. There's been the European Guitar Builders Association, which has sort of helped talk from these, and the schools are starting to collaborate with each other, schools from England and Belgium with the Austrian school and so on and
Mhm.
so forth. um, and that's fantastic. But I know many European guitar makers who tell me stories, that aren't so long ago, maybe 20 years ago, with someone from the guild coming through their shop, and it says, you're selling guitars and you're not a master luthier. You can't do this. And them having to negotiate their way through it. I think Jens Ritter, who is
Yeah.
quite a punk, brought the guy into his workshop and said, "All right, show me how to make this bass. Why don't you show me how to do this? If you're the master who's going to judge me, show me how to do this." And he put him to the task, and the guy left, never came back.
Interesting.
But they
Well,
weren't just
and,
in the
and,
Wild
and
West
over
like
here,
you were. They
anyone
were not
can
allowed to do it. Yeah,
over here, anyone can call themselves a master luthier.
exactly. Yeah, yeah. We'll see. Maybe maybe regulatory systems will
Yeah.
yet come into place here. Maybe they should. Maybe they shouldn't. But it is a distinct difference between you know learning in the period in which you did and where you were
Yeah.
versus trying to learn in other parts of the world where there were strong regulations that were, I guess, intended to protect existing businesses.
Tell you a little
Mhm.
side story. We just conferred the title of Master Luthier to James Whitkiss, who's been
Hmm.
with us for, I think, 14 years.
Hmm.
And as part of the title, I required him to build a masterpiece
Hmm.
guitar, which we displayed at NAMM this year. And
Hmm.
we've done a little bit of promotion, um, partly to get his name out there. By definition, I'm not going to be around forever.
Sure.
This guy's literally still in his 30s, so he's going to be around
Hmm.
for a while.
Hmm.
But I just thought the term master luthier is so overused, I think, in some circles here, that I wanted to add a little bit of rigor to it.
Hmm.
You should build a masterpiece and it should be accepted,
Hmm.
and it should be of your own design, and you don't have to like make every part of it, but you've got to make the unique parts of it.
Hmm.
And he did a great job. Actually, he built two of them. He said, he came back, he said, can I build two? He said, I want to build one in a traditional style, I want to build one in a contemporary style. Oh, that
Yes.
was a great idea.
Hmm. Hmm. Great. And was it peer reviewed? Who
I
decided
was
it
the
was?
peer.
Yeah.
I was
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, the deal was we weren't going to display them if we didn't like them. You know,
Sure.
it wasn't quite said. I mean, of course, I got to watch them be built. I was in the loop,
Hmm.
from the design through the execution period,
Hmm.
and I didn't really put my stamp on anything. I was very, very pleased with the results.
Hmm. Hmm.
But had I not been pleased with the results, I would have coached perhaps more. I
Hmm.
might have said, let's do a redo
Hmm.
before
Hmm.
we promote this thing, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But he
And you didn't
passed.
have to.
He
That's
passed
great.
the exam the first time.
All right. So that brings up a few
Yeah.
questions for me, because this is a really important part. Actually, we spoke a few weeks ago that I've been
Hmm.
thinking a lot and working on the ideas of legacy and succession and what it means, because you're not the only guitar maker who's been making for 50 years who
Hmm.
is aware that you probably won't have another 50 of guitar making, and what that means. And part of the challenge is the key man problem, where
Hmm.
a lot of what the founder does is intuitive and it's their taste and their style. And although they can say that is or isn't it, communicating in a clear, repeatable way to someone else what is and isn't it might be very necessary for the brand moving forward. And so I'm curious to know, if you're okay with talking about it, if you gave criteria to this new master builder, or if you let them build within the ideas of the culture of bourgeois guitars, or did they not look like bourgeois guitars? Sadly, I didn't. I wasn't aware of this beforehand. I would like to see them actually. Did they come out
Uh,
bourgeois or not? Or not? And if they did you apply parameters?
I never really applied parameters.
Hmm.
I think here's how it's likely to work going forward. Like in the early days, I made all the decisions. Well, we got to go to this, are we going to take this custom order? How are we going to deal with it? What are we going to take? What are we going to take to this trade show? um, does this one-off thing that we did deserve becoming a model or becoming, an option or whatever? Those are always seat of the pants decisions that I
Hmm.
made, and some of them were not good, and some of them were good decisions. And so we've tried to formalize this a little bit more. We now have a design committee, which is run by James. James manages our weekly agenda.
Hmm.
And the design committee consists of myself, James, and Andrew Olson, who does a lot of our custom work. He does the CNC drafting. He'll do like a one-off inlay or help design any new one-off thing, design and execute any new one-off thing we might be contemplating doing.
Hmm.
And the two things that we try to respond to are custom requests, number one, and number two, trade show exhibitions. And
Hmm.
our philosophy of trade shows is we want to show a representative example of the kinds of things that we typically build, but we also want to show some futuristic stuff or some different stuff. And it could be different in structure, it could be different in style, it could be a different decoration, but you want to give people who go to these shows year after year something new to want to come and
Yeah.
look at or expect. So
Hmm.
we plan quite a bit in advance. I mean, right now we're starting to plan next year's NAMM show.
Hmm.
We're already building. IBMA will be our last show of this year, our last big show of this year. We're finishing up the stuff that we're building for Fretboard Summit,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, so James controls the agenda or puts together the week's agenda, and we all sort of discuss what our options are. And then
Hmm.
there's always like a wild card slot. Hey, do we want to try this? What do you think?
Hmm.
And lots of times it's a matter of stuff we've talked about for years and never got around to doing it. And now
Hmm.
it's like, okay, there's an opening here. Let's try, you know, T-bars and retro new design,
Hmm.
T-bars and bar frets, stuff like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm. Yeah.
Or, we need a new inlay pattern. Do we want to kind of go modern? Do we want to go kind of traditional? Do we want to go pictorial? That kind of
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm. Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going. This space is normally reserved for brands who make stories like this possible, like the Dario and the Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop. If your company belongs in this conversation, let's talk. We partner with brands who value craft, culture, and the quiet power of a well-placed idea. Yeah.
So that's what kind of moves things forward in the um, innovative in the innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the longer you've been around, the more regular products you've developed. We're kind of rarely like discontinue, like hard stop discontinue things. We
Mm-hmm.
might put something that doesn't get ordered very often into like you know into a custom category. You can order this as a custom thing
Mm-hmm.
because requests come up. Um, and then I guess there's there's always new Tonewoods to try out. For
Mm-hmm.
example, I just came back from Japan and I brought back some Japanese cedar and some figured Japanese cherry.
Mm-hmm.
And with the idea of maybe for the export market, we can come up with a Japanese tonewood model. We've
Yeah.
got to figure out how we want to use it. And that's a great thing for the design team to
Hmm.
discuss.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh,
And maybe if it's really popular in the Japanese market, we'll bring one to Nam and see what happens.
right, right.
So that's
Yeah.
how things tend to progress. We've put stuff out there, throw spaghetti at the wall and see
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
sticks. And,
Hmm.
the most of our dealers are, well, the dealerships fall into two groups. One, the ones who sort of they have their established market, they know what they can sell, and stuff just kind of gets reordered.
Hmm.
And then there's the other dealers who always want something new and different. They want to have something that's unique.
Hmm.
So there's always that demand that kind of keeps us trying to come up with a little something new.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Great.
I figured it costs about $10,000 to develop the tooling for new body and new neck. So,
Mhm.
I need more than one order to
Right.
justify anything that new.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, of course. That's the reality, you know. And I
Yeah.
remember, I hope it's okay. I shared the story. Uh, Mishi Matsuda, I'm sure you must know Mishihiro. Um, he told me a few years back we were at a NAM show together, and he said he had a Japanese magazine ask him a very unusually affronting question for a Japanese person. They're not usually so direct,
Yeah.
and it was basically, "Why are your guitars so expensive? You know, people can't afford them." You know, and Mishi really wasn't expecting this from a Japanese reporter. And
Everything
he
in
wasn't,
Japan is expensive.
well, but even they think a Matsuda's expensive. But, and so, anyways, you know, I thought about it to Mishi. I said, do you know what I would have told the guy? He goes, what? I said, how much do you think it costs Yamaha to develop a $99 guitar they can sell at Costco?
Mm,
It's not 99 bucks.
yeah.
And if you make one-off guitars, if you make original one-off pieces, you know, you have to pack all that R&D into one single
Oh,
instrument, you know,
exactly.
and yeah, they can I bet you it probably costs Yamaha close to $100,000 to develop a single model that they're going to put to marketplace. I can't imagine it costs less. By the time they get it through everything, by the time they do the marketing, by the time they develop the packaging and everything else they're going to do,
Hmm.
I suspect the cost of releasing a 99 or $159 Costco guitar is a $100,000 investment minimum.
Yeah. And I'm just talking about, just the drafting time
Hmm.
and making the molds, that kind of thing, which we would do in house.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 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 So I'm not saying your price is wrong. That wasn't the point I was saying. I was
Yeah.
just,
Yeah.
to your point. When you make one,
Yeah.
you have to absorb all of that into the price of one. You could sell a one-off guitar, but then you would probably be selling that guitar for
Yeah.
30 or
Add
forty
10,000
thousand dollars.
and then you're going to
Yeah.
make a
Yeah. Yeah.
profit. So
That's
it's got
right.
to be
Yeah.
more than that.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. And so it's a good point. All right. So I'm going to dial things back a little bit
Sure.
because I still want to know about your art restoration and what happened, because I think that's really fascinating, because I suspect anyways, it leads into some of the work that you ultimately did with finishes and torfication and looking at things historically and having an eye for them. Is that all just grand assumption, or does any of that relate in your mind?
Well,
What did you
I
learn
never
from that?
really saw art being restored. I mean, when I
Hmm.
worked for the art museum, I saw
Mhm.
things go out and then come back,
Okay.
that sort of thing. And I learned that the process of, you know, deacidifying the paper of a print,
Hmm.
um, or, um, cleaning off the old varnish from a painting, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
I never really saw it happen. It wasn't done in house. It was always, brought out,
Hmm.
sent
Hmm.
out to an expert.
Hmm.
oftentimes at larger museums,
Hmm.
kind of thing. But it was just a process that fascinated me. I mean, I learned how to make mats and frame prints, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. I learned how to hang exhibits. There was a certain formula for for height.
Hmm.
Um, I actually it helped install exhibits. There's quite a bit of sort of technical stuff that went on in the background. It was all designed by someone else, but they needed hands to help,
Hmm.
do the work. And so I got a lot of hands-on in that kind of way. I thought it was all very fascinating. I mean, there was a um, and there's an entertainment component to it, right? And an art
Hmm.
exhibition is has an entertainment component. It's got to be sort of a pleasing experience, to go
Hmm.
through a gallery. There's a lighting component. There's all of this stuff, and I just the technical part of it is what fascinated me.
Hmm.
But as I, you know, interacted with more and more components of that world, people were very status conscious. They were very and it wasn't a warm fuzzy community.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm wrong. I can accept that. It's not a problem for me. So
It was an interesting. It started off as just an interesting student employment,
yeah.
and it just kind of grew into, just sort of being hired as an assistant after I graduated. And
Hmm.
and I thought, well, okay, I can take it beyond this. And then this other thing happened in the guitar world that
Yeah.
I ultimately found more interesting and satisfying.
Yeah. Although I think those lessons, the things you just talked about, if I'm not making too much of it, I think I see it in your work. It is clear that you take more care for your trade show display than most
Yeah.
companies.
Uh, yeah. Yes. Yeah. That's a good point. I learned a little bit that I was able to translate
Yeah.
um, to my current endeavor.
Hmm. Hmm.
I mean,
I
yeah, you pick up a little bit from everything you
yeah.
experience. That may
Yeah.
be the only other job I ever had.
Yeah. Well, sure. But what, there are many people who are good at making guitars who are bafflingly bad at displaying guitars. Like
Mhm.
it's like, wow, you made a really beautiful guitar, and that's incredible how you made it. I'm going to be really rude here for a second. It's incredible as to how much you're taking away from it with that awful display to put your
One
guitar
thing that we learned,
on.
we built our own guitar stands that hold the guitar upright.
Yes.
And because if you lean the guitar, the overhead lighting at NAMM makes
Hmm.
a glare on the top of the guitar. You
Hmm.
walk, along a display and you see all these guitars that are leaning, and
Yep.
the glare hits every guitar, and it also shows up the top distortion, which
Hmm.
inevitably there is.
Hmm.
I just have always thought that looks awful. So the solution was to come up with a guitar stand that holds the guitar totally upright and
Hmm.
at the right height. It
Yes.
can't be too low because
Yep.
then you're looking down at it. And if the focus of the guitar is the inlay on the fretboard, then you want to display it
Hmm.
at a different height than if the focus
Hmm.
of the guitar is the sunburst.
Right.
So a few things like that
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
come into play. Not that I consciously, you're the first person who pointed that out.
Hmm.
Um, that perhaps my museum experience came into play. It's always felt natural to me to just sort of look at, and I'm the same way if I walk into a room. My
Hmm.
wife thinks it's OCD, for me
Hmm.
to pick up like a coat that's been draped over a chair, but
Hmm.
it's an aesthetic sensibility. The
Yeah.
room looks good a certain way, and then if you there's lots of ways to rearrange it that it doesn't look good.
Yeah,
And and you know, I'd rather have it look good than not. It's an
I'm with you.
unconscious thing. Yeah.
I do the exact same thing. And, all of those, when I do the NAM show's boutique guitar showcase, honestly, I have, I want to say this the wrong way. I have very little budget for displays.
Yeah.
And so, the displays at the show, however, do address a number of things that you just talked about. That the table heights are 42 inches. They're not low tables. They're like bar counter heights
Yeah.
because yeah, the body of the guitar is the main focus in most scenarios,
Mhm.
right? And so I don't want to be bending over looking at a table that way. There are no chairs in the boutique guitar showcase. Every guitar show I go to, there are chairs with coats and empty hamburger packages and empty coffee cups. And I'm like,
Yeah.
none of that's happening in my
Yeah.
space. I can stand for work. We're here to do the work. Let's stand up. Let's look presentable. Let's not be slumped over. Let's be awake and alert, and the lighting, all of these things. I can't imagine doing a guitar show without lighting, because when you think about an art gallery, what is it other than an empty room with focus lights? That's all it is. It's directing with the light. Yeah, yeah, and so it's super important to handle that.
And there are different kinds of lights for different kinds of artworks. A dark painting will get a different lighting than a small print, different
Yes.
lighting, obviously, than sculpture.
Yeah.
So I did learn that it's all,
Hmm.
lighting is subject appropriate.
Yes. Absolutely. So I'm in a new place for us here in Italy right now, and I have a number of lights currently, like with like trigger clamps up in the ceiling right now and wires hanging down because I'm still working it out, I'm trying to get the right focus on the lights. As a matter of fact, I have one light on a picture on the wall right now that has a European Coke can over top of it because I couldn't get the right throw, the right
Oh
focus with
yeah.
the light itself. Yeah. But once I figure out what exactly that's going to be, and then of course we'll clean up all the cables and get the right light in there and all this. But it's so important when I walk into a room in my own home. Often there are overhead lights which are just sort of blanket room lights,
Hmm.
which I just have to immediately turn off or dim or something and move into a much more comforting light for me.
Hmm.
So,
And then shop lighting's a whole different thing.
yes, yes, that needs to be bright and clear and energetic. Yeah.
Sometimes too bright, it washes everything,
Sure.
and you don't see like, for example, if you're working on an arch top or something like that, you
Hmm.
want some shadows
You
to
need
give you the
shadow.
depth. Yeah.
Yeah.
A big bright light over the bench is not necessarily the right way to go.
Hmm.
Um, Something from the side or from two sides might be a better way to go.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
An
Yeah,
inspection
absolutely.
light, an inspection light is the kind of it is one of those, you want it to be blasting and glaring and be able to move the instrument around in it, but you
Hmm.
really wouldn't want to work under those lights.
Hmm.
Spray booth lighting is another one.
Yeah.
Um, and that's very difficult because of the explosion proof constraints. But you do
Hmm.
need some kind of a focus light that you can at least bring an instrument into.
Yeah.
So I think about that a lot. Yes.
Hmm. Hmm. No, I'd be very interested to visit your shop. I'll be thinking all about the lighting now for a while. Here in Europe, there's most of the workshop spaces have substantial natural lighting sources.
Hmm.
Like they almost don't make factories that don't have very large sunroofs. Or when you drive through Germany, I'm in Italy right now, but when you drive through Germany, usually the top like 20% of almost
Yeah.
the entire building is open window
Yeah.
all the way around, and they feel so very different. I when I was young, and trying to find my way, I worked in a number of factory and warehouse kinds of settings, and those sort of orangey yellow lights that they had us in. I worked in car parts factories and
Hmm.
do punch press operating and all this, and it was just,
Yeah.
man, the lighting was just so, it was miserable. And then you'd walk outside, and you'd be like, your eyes had to totally adjust because it was so much brighter outside. You'd been kept in the dungeon for a while.
We're in an 1840s textile mill, which
Hmm.
is cheap rent.
Yep.
And the lighting is not great. I mean, it was that the particular part of the mill that we're in was not built with
Hmm.
a lot of windows.
Hmm.
There are some mills that have that, that upper story lighting that uh, that you described, but we're not in one of those. So someday, hopefully in the next few years, we will be able to build a purpose-built guitar workshop.
Hmm.
We already have the land for it, and we kind of
Oh.
had to put a hold on the building project when interest rates, you know, got out of control
Hmm.
post, back during the last couple of years of price, you know, all kinds of prices had been, price inflation.
Yeah. Yeah. The real estate market is in North America, anyways, is quite insane. It's I grew up in the Toronto area, and it has some of the highest pricing in the G7 nations at this point in time. You can't buy a house. You can't buy a one bedroom apartment in the Greater Toronto area for less than $1 million. Like it's insanely high. Um,
Vancouver.
Vancouver is actually the only other city that's more expensive
Yeah.
than Toronto is in that way. Um, Vancouver's pressed in by the mountains. Toronto has some possibilities to keep on expanding. But here in Italy, I mean, it's such population decline that
Yeah.
there are places that are, I mean, it's shocking to North Americans to hear what the prices of places are here and what you can have. And, I know guitar makers here who have huge workshops, like huge, like factory workshops that they're paying $400 a month for. Like
Wow.
it's crazy the difference. you know, and they have a good restaurant really close every time.
There's no there's no bad places to eat in Italy.
No, they can't stay in business. It's true for sure. So, all right, Dana, I want to talk about some of these things that I'd like to get some clarification on, to be honest, because there's a number of things that are associated with you and your work, and I don't want to make the wrong sort of statements, but I certainly associate torrefaction of wood
Mhm.
with you, whether you're the first, one of the first, or just one of the great champions of torrefaction. I'm not really sure. Can you tell me a little bit about this torrefaction story and how it came to
Yeah.
be and why we should care?
Yeah, a lot of the above, I guess, actually. So I first be became aware of torrefied wood, I think through electric guitars. Music Man started making torrefied bass necks,
Hmm.
and I think I happened to see him at an AM show.
Hmm.
Um, and so I was interested, did a little bit of reading, had wondered about, what are the just learning about torrefaction, had wondered what the possibilities were, for acoustic guitars. Um, my first torrefied guitar tops I ever saw were samples sent to me by, I don't remember their name, but the Boucher brothers
Hmm.
produced Adirondack tops in
Hmm.
Quebec,
Hmm.
and I used to drive up a couple times a year and buy tops, and they sent some wood to a local torrefaction kiln and distributed free samples to all of their customers and others.
Mhm.
Um, that's how I first learned of the wood.
Mhm.
I immediately felt that, it was lighter, you know, torrefied wood was lighter, had this like very quick resonance, seemed to have properties that were perfect for acoustic guitars.
Mhm.
I was advised to speak with a Canadian builder from Quebec by the name of Michel Pellerin. I don't know
Mhm.
if you know the name.
Yeah, I know
And
Michelle. He's been in
yeah,
the BGS before in the guitar
yeah.
showcase. Yep. Mhm.
And he had actually built guitars using with torrefied tops
Mhm.
at the time that I first received the wood. So I'll credit Michelle with
Mhm.
educating me and at least being there first. I don't know if there were any other Canadian makers,
Mhm.
but and I know there were some Swedish makers who built guitars, classical guitars with torrefied tops
Mhm.
that I had read about. But at any rate, that one year and this would have been, I think it was 13 or 14 years ago. Um, all of these free samples were distributed,
Mhm.
and eventually I said, well, let's make a guitar out of this. Let's make a couple guitars. Um, let's make a line of guitars because that this wood torrefied wood seemed to have like this quicker, immediate, older, broken in kind of sound. And that's
Mhm.
this kind of sound I had been pursuing, for my entire career.
Yep.
And so one year we showed up at NAM with some guitars with torrefied Adirondack tops.
Mhm.
And I figured, okay, well, there'll be others there. And lo and behold, I didn't, I don't, if there were any others there, I didn't know about it.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I was possibly the first to jump on it. The following year, there were quite a few other
Mhm. Mhm.
manufacturers who brought guitars with torrefied tops. So that's kind of how long it took to snowball.
Mhm.
I guess I'm credited with being the first, probably the first in the American guitar industry. There were a number of boutique builders who were there
Mhm.
before me,
Yep.
but like I said, I look at torrefaction as artificial aging.
Mhm.
Everyone wants to use aged wood. Aged broke played-in guitars are considered, you know, to be superior to brand new guitars. You get a little bit of that with torrefied tops.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think torrefaction, if it's done properly, it removes the volatile uh, compounds that have a damping effect
Mhm.
on wood. And over time, these compounds sort of naturally torrefy, I say.
Mhm.
Um, these compounds gasify and mineralize. And
Mhm.
after that, they don't have the same damping effect on the top. So, the wood vibrates more freely, faster velocity of sound. Um, the downside is that improper torrefaction can damage the cellulose structure of the wood
Mhm.
and essentially make it brittle.
Mhm. Mhm. Yep.
So we learned that the hard way early
Sure.
on, using the wrong wood and then having to replace tops. There's also
Mhm.
a problem with hide glue. Hide glue
Mhm.
does not want to adhere very well
Mhm.
because of the way, I guess, the way it works mechanically.
Mhm.
So we use fish glue, not hide glue, or
Mhm.
aliphatic resin glue,
Mhm.
and all of our bridges are glued with aliphatic resin glue.
Mhm.
if
Hmm.
we're using a torrefied top.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Well, that's interesting. I know people who use the fish glue for the bridges specifically, but the reason they gave is that it just gave them a little more time to work with it. That took a
Yeah,
little longer for bonding, so there's a
it's a hell of a
little
mess
bigger
though.
margin of error. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So, did you take that
So my
in-house or are
philosophy
you?
is the advantage of the torrefied top
Mhm.
greatly balances whatever disadvantages, that thin film of glue might introduce.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. So, are you still buying your torrefied woods from an external source or do you do it in-house now?
Well, we did it in house for a while. We built our own kiln, but it was kind of a
Mhm.
bust.
Mm.
Um, it was a little crude, and we didn't get consistent results and didn't really know why. And
Mhm.
it costs a lot of money to fill a kiln with quality tops.
Mhm. Mhm.
This is a 4x4x4 uh, scientific oven,
Mhm.
and then later on there was a market. You could buy the tops already torrefied.
Mhm.
The Bouchers, one of the problems was that the kiln that the Bouchers were using stopped accepting their wood just because they were busy torrefying other things like
Mhm.
flooring and trim work, and it's a different formula
Mhm.
or
Mhm.
a different recipe for cooking, guitar
Right.
wood than other kinds of wood.
Yeah.
And so other people started selling wood. So we started buying wood where we could. There's a
Mhm.
there was a kiln in the Midwest that we would send wood to, but we didn't always get the results we wanted. So finally, we bought a kiln. We now have a Chinese made kiln,
Mhm.
and we've really just started using it. We've torrefied several batches. I believe it's 1,000 board feet is the
Mhm.
um, is the capacity of the kiln, and you have to fill it.
Mhm.
Although, if you don't fill it, you can fill it with junk wood,
Mhm.
and do a partial load. We've
Yeah.
we're also we've also built a sawmill, so we are producing our own Adirondack topwood.
Mhm. Mhm.
Just kind of went online this year. We're not, the harvesting period is in the winter, so
Mhm.
we've gone through the few logs that we acquired, taken
Mhm.
a while to set things up. We'll be geared up, you know, next November. We'll be buying logs regularly and be in more full operation. We're sort of in R&D mode now,
Right.
learning how the best way to break down a log, working with our torrefaction formulas, that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Although we've
Mhm.
gotten consistently good results, you know, um, just by following the recommended recipes.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So you refer to it as sort of vintage or old sounding, but can you attempt to talk in a bit of a what do you think is actually happening in a sort of physics sense? What are you getting more from here when the torrefication is happening? What is changing as far as the response of the wood is concerned for you, the properties of the wood? You talked a bit about the crystallization and such, but what does it mean to the player and how the guitar top
I
performs?
think it's I think it's just more responsive, than a brand new guitar top. I mean, the problem the problem with building new guitars is they sound better later on. And
Mhm.
so the idea
Is it a
is,
fact?
pardon me?
Is that a fact? Do you think that's always the case?
Some people say, gee, I really like the sound of a new guitar. It's a little bit fleeting, and but then they find they even like it better. Um,
Mhm.
so when when you play a note on a guitar, you're not, the body and the top of the guitar respond to more than just the fundamental tone. There's a series of overtones.
Mhm.
That series of overtones is produced in, naturally and in and fully in a vibrating string. The trick is to be able to amplify all of those overtones,
Mhm.
and you know and a top that has a high velocity of sound is able to do that. The idea is you don't want to kill that overtone sequence. It's like you play a note up the neck on the top string, and you can hear it swell, and that's the
Mhm.
overtones blooming.
Mhm.
That tends to happen more freely and more fully in a broken in older instrument. And
Mhm.
so to sort of get that full effect in a brand new guitar, you want to manipulate everything, that it's possible to manipulate. You want a thin finish. You want to use materials that have low damping. Um, you don't want to build a guitar that's too heavy, physically too
Mhm.
heavy, and you want to use materials that have a high velocity of sound. Adirondack spruce is interesting in the sense that, well, like European spruce, alpine spruce tends to respond more fully at a lower dynamic range. Fingerstyle players can um, get a very full response from a guitar without having to, play
Give a lot
as
of energy.
heavily as a
Mhm.
guy in a bluegrass band, with a flat pick.
Mhm. Mhm.
However, those kind of guitars, if you play in a bluegrass band with a flat pick, you're going to overplay them. You're
Yeah.
going to get, you're not going to get that fullness. They're gonna, you know, hit a headroom ceiling kind of
Mhm.
thing.
Mhm.
So Adirondack spruce tends to respond to that style of strumming, playing with the pick. It can also, it can also respond well to fingerstyle playing, but you got to build a lighter guitar
Mhm.
to bring that out. But um, an older vintage guitar generally has more headroom. You get that fullness, that clarity without having to work so hard.
Mhm. Mhm. What do you lose?
With Torrefaction,
Everything's a trade-off, right? So
sure.
if it's becoming warmer, if it's becoming whatever, it is changing from one state to the other. So
Mhm.
there's a loss of something. Now you may want to lose it, but but what is it that is being lost as far as the
Well, the thing
musicality
that
is
people
concerned, the
point
response? Yeah.
to most often is, say, well, these guitars made in the 1930s are now 90 years old, right?
Mhm.
We're almost to 100 years old, and these guitars keep getting better. At
Mhm.
what point do do they stop getting better? Is my new guitar with a torrefied top going to last 100 years?
Mhm.
And I would say, do you care?
Mm.
I don't know. The question is, so if we have made a guitar sound 10 years older from the get-go, are we taking 10 years off the life at the other end of the guitar? We don't really know that, but
Mhm.
the trade-off is you get to enjoy it now.
Mhm. Mhm.
We have to sell them now.
Yeah, sure.
the customer the customer wants their full value now.
Yeah, well, the customer has a certain expectation, right? And we're all trying to
Mhm.
meet that particular expectation, And so I'm I'm not trying to put you on the spot here. I think as I think most people do, we think in juxtapositions because
Sure.
we know that silk is smooth because sandpaper is rough. It's what is the opposite. So when you say it is
Mhm.
getting better, I'm thinking, well, what is it not getting? What is it? Where are we coming
Yeah.
from? What has changed? What is there? I had a piece of salmon for lunch today, and I went to grab a bottle of wine, and I thought I had a chilled Chardonnay, and I didn't. I had a local Vermentino, which is a lovely wine. But you know what I missed? I missed that bright crispness of the Chardonnay. The Vermentino
Mhm.
wasn't quite right with the salmon. The fattiness of the salmon needed something the acid
Mhm.
to cut it. And to me, that's actually what happens with the guitars, is that there is a moment where you want that brighter hi-fi kind of cut and response that can be appropriate for certain styles of music and certain approaches. And a guitar can become somewhat dull over time for certain things. Now, other people would say those guitars are brash, they're too bright. I don't like that. I want a guitar that's warm and full, and it's a different kind of response. But I prefer not to see the world in good and bad. I prefer to see the world
Yeah.
in, usefulness and and in what context might I want this and what context might I want that. I don't have a favorite wine. I might have a wine I prefer in the moment for a particular
Sure.
task, and it's the same thing for me with musical instruments. To me, there is no best guitar. There may be a guitar which accomplishes a particular task better than anything else, but it's always relative to what we're trying to accomplish.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah. Very well said. And isn't it great that we don't all build exactly the same guitar?
right.
Right.
Yeah,
It'd be
and you
number
don't
one.
build all the same guitar. You build many iterations of your own guitars. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Mhm.
Different flavors, different characters with the different tone woods. I look at, torrefied wood as just a different tone wood. It's a tone wood
Mhm.
option.
Mhm.
I prefer torrefied Adirondack. Do we do use some torrefied alpine spruce,
Mhm.
and it has its own character. We don't torrefy redwood because it's too brittle. We don't torrefy most of the woods that we use because I
Mhm.
don't see a big advantage, and I see the downside, the brittleness.
Mhm.
Uh, we've torrefied mahogany. It's very difficult to bend the sides without breaking. We
Mhm. Mhm.
torrefy maple, and that works very well. Maple tends to
Mhm.
go from a very I sort of call it inert.
Mhm. Mhm.
It doesn't really detract from the sound, but it doesn't add a lot of color. A maple guitar sounds mostly like the top to me.
Mhm.
Torrefied maple back and sides add sort of like a little more richness to that. But
Mhm.
on the other hand, you might want that Everly Brothers, you know, sort of homogeneous strum,
Mhm. Mhm.
which you get from an untorrefied maple guitar. So
Mhm.
as you're saying, you can sort of, we're adjusting the ingredients um, to change the entree.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. So another thing that your website talks about is it talks about bolt-on necks.
Hmm.
And what can you help me clarify what it is and what your sort of history with that is? Because it's not so long ago that people were like, "Oh, it's not a real acoustic guitar; it's got a bolt-on neck."
Right.
Like really
Yeah.
not so long ago. Like maybe in the last decade, we were still talking about that. I don't think we talk about it very much at all now, but it really was a topic of discussion up until about 10 years ago. And so, how did that
That
how did that
come
come to be, and why did you choose to fight that battle? Because it was a battle. Would have been easier not to do that in as far as the court of public opinion is concerned.
Sure. The um that all comes from my experience of repairing and restoring guitars.
Mhm.
A guitar that's built lightly enough to sound as good as it can sound is probably going to need a neck reset sometime in
Mhm.
its life.
Mhm. Mhm.
And if I'm alive, I'm going to have to do it kind of thing. I can build, I can imagine how I could build a guitar that would never need a neck reset, but um, I can't imagine how I would make it sound the way I want it to sound.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I just sort of accept that as a feature and built it into the design of the guitar. We can
Mhm.
reset a neck in about 20 minutes,
Mhm.
which is, I just think, a big advantage. We get lots of guitars back, that have been just never treated properly.
Mhm.
It dry out in the wintertime, with with humidipacks these days. There's really almost no excuse, for
Mhm.
not creating a properly climate controlled environment inside your case, but
Mhm.
people still don't use them. Same with the opposite. A guitar that goes to live uh, in a humid environment is going to move around and become unplayable.
Mhm.
So at any rate, um, I just consider it an advantage both to the player and to the manufacturer,
Mhm.
who is mostly sort of like we're on first call to deal with this stuff
Mhm.
when the cars become unstable for one reason or another, or just because they're so many years old and things have moved around a little bit.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I've got
And
guitars that have been out there for a long time now.
right.
I've got one in
Yeah.
my one here that I built in the 70s. It does
Yeah.
not have a bolt-on neck. I'm going to
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
reset the neck of it, or so I'm going to have it done.
Right. Right. Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com. Are you serious about the business of guitar? Then you need to join us on Patreon. We're building a future where guitar makers are able to live prosperous lives making instruments that inspire the musical experience, which helps to create a more beautiful world. Where others who are passionate about the guitar can thrive, those who help in the promotion and resale, trade shows, writing of books and articles are supported as a valuable part of the community. A community where we explore with curiosity and encourage those around us in their endeavors. With a community effort, we can accomplish far more than we can individually. So let's be serious about your guitar business and join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Jamie Gale Music. We are better together, so let's do this together. I love where we've been, and I'm excited about where we're going. This space is normally reserved for brands who make stories like this possible, like the Dario and the Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop. If your company belongs in this conversation, let's talk. We partner with brands who value craft, culture, and the quiet power of a well-placed idea. Yeah, and did you find that there was a noticeable sonic difference, or response difference in the instrument with your bolt-on neck?
I didn't. I mean, I think if the neck joint is tight and solid, it shouldn't be. I remember someone asking me that question, and last year I was at Brian Sutton's Blue Ridge Guitar Camp,
Mm-hmm.
and one of the evening events, everyone, well, not everyone, a number of people were asked to play a snippet of some piece of music that was inspiring to them, typically guitar music. So
Mm-hmm.
Billy Strings played, he was like the last guy to
Mm-hmm.
play a piece of music, and he played the he played Brian Sutton's solo to Get Up John on the first Ricky Skaggs bluegrass album, Bluegrass
Mm-hmm.
Rules. It's like
Mm-hmm.
this like fiery guitar solo. Billy talked about it being like when he was like really young, it was like that was his inspiration. He just wanted to play like that.
Mhm.
And Jake Workman leans over. He said, "Hey, you built that guitar, didn't you?" And I wasn't even thinking about it. I said, "Oh, yeah, I guess I did."
Yeah, yeah.
And someone had just asked me, "Can you hear the difference?" And, and so I saw him later that night. I said, "Did you hear that the that piece that Billy played?" I said, "Could you hear the neck joint?" So it's not about the neck joint; it's about the guitar.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, of course. But I'm also talking to a guy who decided to scallop one side of a set of braces. And so, we can also make the argument that there definitely is minutia that we fret
Sure.
over and and are concerned about, right? And
Yeah.
so, the answer can be no, Jamie. I don't hear a difference, and that's perfectly fine with me. It's not a fighting point. It's just a matter of the I spend so much time talking with guitar makers from all around the world, and I made my career on people who are really pushing boundaries. The freak show, basically, the really strongly innovative people. Whether their innovations are going to stick or not. The point is, I've had many late nights through probably many bottles of wine, talking about the minutia of these things. And one of the things that came up in a conversation maybe a year or two ago with a guitar maker in Venice, Italy, who is a structural engineer by trade. He worked as a structural engineer for about 14 or 15
Mhm.
years. And I asked him, I said, how does your training as a structural engineer influence your guitar design? And he makes electric guitars that have this sort of suspended arch top on an aluminum frame. It's Enrico Di Donato was his name. And he said, well, I knew I needed a central mass. I said, explain that to me. He said, okay, when we make a building or a bridge, we have a central column or a central mass,
Mhm.
and then we have beams that go off in opposite directions. And that central is a balance point, but because of that, structurally speaking, it creates a centralized nodal point that balances the forces so the whole thing doesn't shake itself apart to a certain extent, right? And I
Yeah.
thought that was really a way of phrasing things that I'd never heard from a guitar maker. I'd never heard a guitar maker tell me they needed a central mass at the neck joint. And
Mhm.
of course, we do have a centralized mass, with a neck block, with the heel, all of that. And even with the electric guitars, and there's often bolts and such happening there. There is a centralized mass there. And recently, do you know Joe Glazer? You must
Sure.
know Joe. Yeah. So
Yeah.
recently, Joe was here visiting us, and we were talking about his early days, and he made a lot of electric guitars for a lot of famous country players. And the
Mhm.
thing that Joe did is he paid a lot of attention to weight on bodies and necks, and he got really light bodies, necks, and got them balanced. And I said, when they balance, you have that centralized weight point in the middle. Did you ever pay attention to that? He also said no. We got to thinking about that and talking about it. And
Mhm.
so let's not get too far off on the trail of that. The point is, it's something worth thinking about. Actually, is how the guitar does have a centralized structure, whether it's completely, whether it's causal or completely correlated. We don't really know, but the fact is, it is. And when we see guitars that are not functioning very well, sometimes, especially if it is a bolt-on, you can change the neck on that guitar to get more in balance with the body, and you'll
Mhm.
find the system starts to respond in a different way, and perhaps an improved way for your purposes. And so there are people who do that. Yeah.
I have metal bars
Hmm.
on either side of the truss rod. I have a double
Hmm.
action truss rod, and I do that. I think for a balance thing, for adding some weight to the neck, some
Hmm.
mass to the neck. I found that with a truss rod, you can change the shape of the neck, but it's not rigid necessarily. If you hold the headstock, you can move it around,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that can't be good for. I mean, you don't want the neck to be vibrating because it's robbing energy from the string that you want to be driving the top.
Hmm.
So there's a so I guess my sense of balance comes in there. Um,
Mhm.
there's certain parts you want to be rigid, and there's certain parts you want to be flexible, and sort
Yes.
of sort of balancing that out. I do have a very large brace between above the sound hole, and
Transverse
that's
break.
sort of part of my system. I have
Mhm.
a you know hung on the top of the neck block, and then that
Yeah.
that ties into the brace.
Mhm. Mhm.
So what may have been lost in rigidity by not gluing in a dovetail, these other structural things compensate on
Mhm.
some
Mhm.
level. My whole approach has always been, try it, does it work?
Mhm. Mhm.
I don't really have an engineering background. I,
Yeah.
I it, when I decide that something works, I do try to figure it out and understand it on a theoretical level, at least a basic, what's
Mhm.
going on here kind
Mhm.
of level. But I'm not really, I don't use engineering principles to design forward.
Mhm.
It's more like, okay, what are we missing here? What could be better? And over time, the exact design of this whole neck system has been refined little
Mhm.
by little. We haven't really changed anything in quite a while. So I don't, I guess until I decide that it needs something,
Mhm.
we've got something that works for us.
Yeah. 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 So I don't mean to impugn that one should always think about it in an engineering perspective.
Yeah.
One of the things that I really enjoy doing is speaking with people from different disciplines and learning
Mhm.
how they approach the same topic. They'll often use a
Exactly.
different word set, a different theory or different philosophy about it that is maybe very normal within their industry or within their work. But when you hear that word, it triggers a whole new way of thinking within your processes, and I
Exactly.
find that really
Yeah.
stimulating. And so, yeah. So when I started to think, when I asked you about that, so second time he's come up today, the German bass maker Jens Ritter um, did experiments with the same piece of wood to try and figure out in the electric bass market whether you should do a bolt on or a set neck through, what was going to be the way he was going to go. And actually, what he decided in the end was a massive bolt setup where on a 5 string bass he's got 10 bolts in that thing. Yeah, but I think it has to do with that centralized mass.
Mhm.
And it really works. He's an incredible amount of sustain, but he still has a certain kind of attack because, on a bolt-on electric instrument, you have a more attack, with the instrument. And when you set the neck on them, you tend to, the whole system works a little bit differently and you have more sustain, but you lose some of that attack. You really can't play a Stevie Ray Vaughan style shuffle on a Les Paul. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so what he found is he could get all of that singing sustain that he liked out of maybe something like a Federa or an Alembic, but he could also get the slapping and the percussive nature of what he liked from a jazz bass or a P bass
Mhm.
by doing this massive bolt design. So, anyways,
The
maybe too
guitar
much on neck
is,
joints.
yeah, the guitar is, um, I don't know, it's just a combination of all of these elements. There's no one silver bullet. For an acoustic
Mhm.
guitar, I guess everyone would agree that the top plays plays the largest role, but that same top on a totally different instrument is going to be very different. So
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
the interaction of all of these elements.
Mhm. Mhm.
You hear people saying, well, it's the secret is hide glue, or the secret is nitrocellulose lacquer, or the secret is this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah.
And all of these elements can play a significant role in the right mix,
Mhm.
but they've got to be used. It's just, it's like John Monteleone once said, Um, I think of myself as a race car driver and a chef. I'm a chef in that I'm combining all of these instruments, and a race car driver in that I've got to make decisions quickly. So the chef part was the metaphor that I think I wanted to draw attention to. It's the way you put the ingredients together.
Yes.
We're still small enough so that we can build, we do build guitars individually. We built over 600 guitars last year, and
Mhm,
everyone is treated a little bit differently. The
mhm,
thicknessing of the top is individual, has to do with the stiffness, the shaping of the bracing, the pairing of the top and the back.
mhm,
Certain things are more standardized, the application of the finish, um, the way a truss rod is installed, that sort of thing. You want precision, repetition. You want to do
mhm,
it
mhm,
the same way every time, but other things you want to leave, you want to be able to make adjustments
mhm,
to make that guitar as good as it can be.
mhm,
So that's
mhm.
the approach we've always taken, and I think a good chef does the same thing. The ingredients change from season to
Yes.
season, or even within the season. From source to source, you
Mhm,
make certain adjustments. A little different
mhm,
seasoning here, uh, you know, changes in a sauce, or what vegetable you'd pair you know, with the protein, that kind of thing.
mhm, mhm. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so we're still able to do that.
Mhm, mhm. Well, that brings up an interesting question. Well, I think it's interesting, and that is so. So let me set it up for a second. So to me, all of those aspects that you just talked about with the guitar, in a sense of just, I like to really generalize things. I like to understand things in the simplest form possible, and to resolve the complexity. And Constantine Brancusi said that simplicity is complexity resolved. And so I feel like I don't fully understand something until I can communicate it in the most simple way. And so when I tried to understand building guitars, because I'm not just talking about building acoustic guitars, I'm talking about electric guitars, resophonic guitars, whatever it happens to be, different materiality, because I
Mhm.
work with people who use different materials also, whether it be carbon fiber or aluminum or wood, each one of these things is a variable. And so in the simplest form, I think we are directing energy. Energy in the physics sense is also movement. Movement and energy are the same word in physics. You just choose which one you're going to use. So we're directing the movement of energy, let's say, through a series of obstacles and affordances to put the energy where we want it in the system and to keep it from where we do not want it in the
Mhm.
system. Like you making your necks more rigid to keep
Mhm.
the energy from being lost in the neck and directing it into where you want it in that top or in the body from there. And so, but that starts with kinetic action from us. We move a string. And this is something that I've found is something that everyone takes for granted, or not everyone. Majority of people I know use whatever guitar string they started using at some point in time in their history, and it almost doesn't matter which guitar it is. There's a string they buy, and that string just goes on those guitars. And I think the string has a much more substantial impact on a guitar than most people give it credit for. And so, what's your approach to? Maybe you think I'm full of shit. Like what? Maybe you think that's nonsense. What's your approach to guitar strings? You use the same strings across everything, the same gauge, the same materials. Do you change it if you need to because this guitar needs a little more help on the top end, or is it a blanket approach?
The weird thing is, though, you send a guitar out into the world, and
Hmm.
you don't know what string is going to go on it.
Mm-hmm.
The same guitar in the hands of five different players will get five different kinds of strings.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could be the same brand, light and medium on the same guitar. So
Mm-hmm.
I just look at strings as a reference point. I want to be able to, I mean, it's the hardest thing you have that you can do, I think, is you need to, this guitar that's coming off your bench now, you want to, how do you want to refer it to everything else you've ever done? And that gets into all kinds of psychoacoustics and your memory and all of that stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
um, if something is really different, you want to be able to be aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I just pick a string that I'm familiar with, and I've been using D'Addario strings forever.
Mm-hmm.
I started out with the J16s and J17s, and then
Mm-hmm.
moved on to the coated version. Tell you a story. I didn't like the first coated versions at
Mm-hmm.
all. I thought they were too dull. And then a couple years later, I remember telling a guy in our setup department, man, I'm so glad we got rid of those coated strings. And he said, "Oh, I
Mm-hmm.
thought you ordered them again. That's what we're using." As it turns
Mm-hmm.
out, I mentioned that to Peter D'Addario at a NAMM show, and he said, "Oh, we've changed it. We've changed that formula. We've been,
Yeah.
refining it." So at any rate, eventually the coated strings got to the point where I liked them. They have a new coating now that I don't like as much as the original refined
Mm-hmm.
version, the EXPs. So that's
Mm-hmm.
essentially what we order. I don't like coated unwound strings, but it's mostly from a point of view of reference. If the guitar sounds different, I want to know it's the guitar and not the
Mm-hmm.
string.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then as it goes out into the world, as I say, the player is going to adapt the guitar to his or her own preferences. It might get a different pickup. It might get a different string gauge. It might get a different string type, different string material.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
all up to the player to understand their preferences. I mean, we certainly get asked for recommendations along these lines, and we always say, well, pick a reference and get used to it, and then change it, and then see what you like better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And every NAMM show, I come home with new strings
Mm-hmm.
and just try them on my own guitars, which are guitars that I live with all the time and I know.
Yeah.
And sometimes I really like the strings, and sometimes I don't like the strings. And I'm always asking myself, well, do we want to change our reference points?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the answer, I've never said yes.
Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. Yeah, yeah. And so, but you said you were using the 16s and the 17s. I mean, that's a gauge difference,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And so,
So we
what
do
when
use
would you
two
choose
different
one versus the other?
gauges.
Okay, why?
Typically on a guitar that could be played finger style, we'll use lights. If it's a
Mm-hmm.
dreadnought, slope shoulder dreadnought, or even a small jumbo, we'll use a medium gauge string. Been a
Mm-hmm.
lot of pushback on that from dealers because the a lot of dealers say that everyone expects lights on everything these days.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of our uh, end users play roots music.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a preference for medium gauge strings in a lot of that, you know, music community. So we haven't changed yet.
Yeah, yeah. Okay.
Certainly wouldn't put light gauge strings on most bluegrass guitars and most dreadnoughts, although
Yeah,
most
sure.
dreadnoughts aren't played by bluegrass players. So the guitars that we make in conjunction with Eastman are all strung with lights, whether they're dreadnoughts or not,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
they're going to a more of an intermediate level player.
Hmm.
Playability is more of a factor.
Hmm.
Um, People who buy, guitars in the high end are usually, well, I like to describe sort of our original core of clientele as serious players, experienced players of all levels of ability.
Hmm. Hmm.
And that would include myself.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
sure.
but the serious and experienced means that they know what they're buying.
Hmm.
They know what the guitar is supposed to do. They're sort of beyond. They're beyond the intermediate level of sort of learning all of this stuff. They're buying a
Hmm.
guitar for a purpose.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting aspect, and I do want to talk more about that, but I think we'll save that for our extended segment of the business of guitar. The regular part of the podcast, we should probably be looking to wrap up at this point in time. And so, Dana, before I close with any of our guests, I always like to give it back to you for a moment to say, is there a question or that I should have asked or a topic that you would have hoped to have discussed today that we didn't bring up that have
Oh boy, we've covered a lot. Uh, Almost hour and a half or so, or more,
Mhm.
actually, probably hour and 45 minutes, gone by fairly quickly. Um, I guess we haven't talked about what the next generation of bourgeois guitars might look like,
Mhm.
or the
Mhm.
next generation of management for bourgeois guitars.
Yeah.
Where are we headed? We haven't talked about the Eastman connection.
Yeah.
I could address that a little bit.
Yeah, that's what I want to talk to you with in our
Mhm.
business of guitar section.
Okay,
So, you know what? If we want to talk about that, then let's just wrap up this section here and
sounds good.
say, Dana, thank you so much for being on Life with Strings Attached. It's been great. Thank you for being so generous with your time and answering my questions. I appreciate it.
Very good questions.
Yeah.
You made the time go by quickly.
Oh, good, good, good. Is this going to be over? Is the worst. Yeah, yeah.
Well,
So,
after almost 2 hours, you find yourself thinking that, and I'm thinking, is it really? We need to wrap it up now.
yeah, yeah. That's a good
So
sign. That's a good sign.
yeah,
Means I'm doing my job right. So, we're gonna, for those of you listening, Dana and I are gonna talk for another few minutes on the business of guitar, and so that our guests are comfortable talking about the business aspects. We do that over kind of behind a hidden paywall, if you will, on Patreon. And if you're in the guitar business and you want to hear about the inside bits of business, please go over to patreon.com/business of guitar. Again, that's patreon.com/business of guitar. And Dana and I are going to talk about some inside business there in just a few minutes. So, Dana, let's wrap this up and say goodbye, and then we'll move on to business guitar. So
okay. Thank you,
thanks so
Jamie.
much for being on the show.
You
All
bet.
right. Ciao for now.
Ciao.
You've been listening to Life with Strings Attached. If today's conversation meant something to you, consider passing it on. These stories find their place through the people who share them. A new episode comes out every Friday, right here, wherever you're listening. I'm Jamie Gale, and thanks for listening to Life with Strings Attached.